Okay, let's untack this truly universal and, I mean, often pretty demoralizing experience.
Mm-hmm.
You know the one?
Mm.
That sinking feeling when you open an email or you get that
Yeah.
instant message. The one that's just unnecessarily blunt or overly critical.
Or just dismissive, yeah.
Exactly. And it makes you instantly question your value, maybe even your entire career choice.
And it often gets packaged as, tough love or I'm just being efficient.
Right.
But this isn't just about individual personalities or bad office manners. This is a huge issue. Our sources call it the communication chasm, and it's a critical organizational problem.
It's what's driving people to leave their jobs.
Absolutely. It drives talent turnover, it destroys psychological safety, and it stifles the very innovation that companies say they want.
So our mission today, it isn't to just label managers as bad. We're not here for the water cooler gossip.
No.
We're going to move beyond the blame and use psychological and structural research to really diagnose the systemic reasons behind this huge communication disconnect.
And we have a fascinating stack of sources that explain not just what bad communication looks like, but the 4 core psychological roots that cause good people.
People who got promoted for being great at their jobs.
Exactly. People who are competent. And it shows how they can become, well, terrible communicators.
And that diagnosis is so important, right?
Yeah.
Because if you understand the mechanism, then you can actually build the bridge to fix it.
That's the core insight. We're starting from the idea that poor managerial communication is it's a predictable outcome. It comes from skill gaps and systemic pressure, not, malice.
Okay, so let's dive right in. The deepest root of this issue. It seems really counterintuitive. It starts with Dr. Keltner's research on what's called the power paradox.
Mm-hmm.
So how does gaining power actually make a leader worse at the very skills that got them promoted in the first place?
It's an incredible, almost cruel insight. You gain power, whether that's social, positional, economic, whatever. You get it through skills like empathy, collaboration, strong social calibration.
The so-called soft skills.
The essential skills. But the experience of having that power can actively, physically degrade those foundational abilities in your brain.
That idea that the tool you use to get the power is destroyed by the power itself. That feels just fundamentally unfair. How fast does Keltner say this starts to happen?
It's insidious. So power triggers what he calls a power approach tendency. The brain literally shifts its focus.
Okay.
So instead of worrying about interpersonal connection, reading subtle cues from people, which you have to do when you're trying to gain influence, the brain becomes hyper-focused on executing its own goals.
On leveraging resource.
And leveraging resources. It's all about the objective.
So their neural pathways start prioritizing efficiency over diplomacy. I think we've all been on the receiving end of that neural shield, as it were.
We have. It shifts the manager from being a collaborator to being the chief resource allocator almost overnight.
Right.
The sources call it a kind of neural hubris syndrome, where the leader just stops calibrating their language for how it will land with people.
So the condescending tone, the abrupt dismissal of an idea.
It's often just a lack of perspective taking. It's driven by their new elevated position. It's not always an intentional slight. They literally stop registering the microsignals of discomfort in their team.
That makes the condescending email feel a lot less personal, but no less damaging.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's move from those internal power dynamics to the external pressures of the job. Because we also have to consider the intense, just overwhelming mental toll that comes with being a modern leader.
And that brings us to the cognitive load of leadership. I mean, just think about what a manager is juggling today.
Oh, yeah.
Strategic targets, budget restrictions, endless demands from stakeholders, and they're supposed to manage their own personal lives on top of that.
It's a massive amount of mental bandwidth.
An immense amount. It's related to Baumeister's ego depletion theory. This constant depletion just strips away the finite cognitive resources you need for emotional regulation and, nuanced empathetic communication.
So when the brain is exhausted, the cognitive surplus that you need for diplomacy it's gone.
Precisely. Under high stress, high load, the brain defaults to fast, automatic, and often blunt communication.
Just easier.
It's cognitively cheaper. That careful diplomatic phrasing, The response that validates the person while still giving critical feedback, that requires deep prefrontal cortex engagement.
Which is the first thing to go offline when you're stressed.
Right, so a depleted leader just communicates quickly to get the item off their plate and conserve energy. They choose bluntness because it's cheap.
That explains why the worst communication always seems to show up late on a Friday afternoon.
It's a totally predictable pattern, all driven by resource scarcity.
Okay.
Now let's tackle a different kind of problem. The person who was promoted because they were technically brilliant, the best engineer, the top salesperson.
The star individual contributor.
Yes. This is where the expertise trap snaps shut.
This is such a common path to management, and it sounds like it's one of the riskiest.
It's a profound double bind. So first, they fall victim to the curse of knowledge.
Which is?
It's a cognitive bias that makes it genuinely difficult for them to remember what it's like not to know their area of expertise.
Got it.
So a star programmer who becomes a manager might tell a junior dev, oh, it's obvious you just need to use the API 5 connector. The language is exclusionary, it's jargon-filled, and it just drips with impatience because to them, the process is obvious.
They literally can't see the gap between their own knowledge and where their employee is starting from.
Right.
And that impatience directly fuels the second trap, which is the micromanagement we see everywhere.
Correct. That deep expertise often fuels micromanagement because they can have what the sources call illusory superiority. It's like a reverse Dunning-Kruger effect, meaning they genuinely believe, I can do this task better or I can do it faster. And that belief compels them to constantly intervene to over-control the process.
Which paradoxically prevents their employees from ever gaining the competence they need to be autonomous.
You nailed it. They fail to make the transition from player to coach.
They confuse being a manager with being the best individual on the team.
Exactly. And by constantly correcting minor things like stylistic choices or process details, they strip the employee of any psychological ownership. It stifles any development of their strategic muscle.
And the team just becomes dependent on them.
Which just reinforces the manager's own cognitive load. It becomes this horrible, vicious cycle.
Before we get to the fixes, we have to touch on the darker side of this, I guess. The one that sometimes isn't about cognitive load or the power paradox, but the feeling of having too little power.
That's the dynamic rooted in insecurity. So if a boss feels threatened by a high-performing employee, or maybe they feel like an imposter in their own role.
Like they were promoted too quickly.
Right, they might overcompensate. And this often manifests as overtly authoritarian communication or public criticism or just rigid processes to assert dominance.
So it stops being about leading the team and starts being about the manager's own self-protection.
It's entirely about self-protection and boundary enforcement.
So we have the power paradox, cognitive load, the expertise trap, and insecurity. 4 really powerful drivers. But what ties all these individual psychological roots together seems to be one massive, glaring systemic failure.
The missing training pipeline.
Exactly.
It's the stark reality of modern organizations. Companies will lavish resources on rewarding technical excellence with a promotion, but they often provide zero mandatory training in the necessary power skills. Things like nonviolent communication or motivational interviewing, diplomatic feedback.
Emotional regulation.
All of it. They treat communication as a soft skill that you either have or you don't.
Instead of a critical, measurable, and trainable leadership discipline, the system promotes the expert, but then fails to give them the manager's toolkit.
And that is exactly why the chasm exists. But knowing the diagnosis lets us build targeted, actionable solutions.
Okay, so let's look at the how. The specific scenarios we've all been in, and the fixes from the sources. We need frameworks that can immediately bridge this chasm.
Let's start with the classic condescending boss. Remember David, the manager who cuts off his junior designer Maya, calling her idea cute?
Ooh, yes.
That's the power paradox in action. It's a failure to calibrate language and take perspective. The manager just registers the idea as low value and then communicates that bluntly.
And this can't just be nicer. That's not helpful. It has to be a real framework.
It requires perspective taking as a discipline, specifically using what's called bridge and pivot diplomacy.
Bridge and pivot. Okay.
So the manager's instinct is to dismiss. This framework forces validation first. Instead of dismissing, David has to validate Maya's cognitive input. He says, Maya, I truly appreciate you thinking outside the box. That creative energy is exactly what we need. That's the bridge.
And then the pivot.
The pivot guides that energy toward the real-world constraints without crushing the idea. So David continues. Now, given the constraints of our existing technical framework and the budget, how can the core innovative insight of your idea be adapted or scaled down to fit our immediate reality?
He validates her and then pivots the focus to collaborative problem solving.
Exactly. And Maya is much more likely to bring him more ideas later.
Absolutely. Okay, next up, emotional volatility.
Mhm.
The boss who screams in public, like Linda dressing down Sam over a missed deadline, that's a textbook amygdala hijack.
It is. It's pure cognitive load hitting that fight or flight button. The leader's prefrontal cortex, their executive function, is completely offline. They cannot reason effectively.
So what does Linda need?
She needs the regulate, relate, reason protocol. The first step, regulate, is physical. It's non-negotiable. She has to stop, physically pause, take 2 deep breaths, and move the conversation to a private space.
Re-engage her executive functions before she even speaks again.
You cannot solve a problem while the amygdala is driving. The second step is relate. Once they're in private, she has to start by acknowledging the shared stress. Sam, I know this is stressful for both of us, and I apologize that our conversation started so emotionally. She has to own the dynamic.
And then finally, reason. How does she shift the focus?
She shifts it from personal blame to collaborative action. She asks, help me understand the key obstacles you faced. Let's look forward. What are our 3 most viable contingency plans right now?
It redirects all that energy outward, onto the problem itself. It's constructive, not shaming.
Exactly.
Okay, the third scenario, the micromanager.
Hmm?
This one is maybe the most insidious because it operates so quietly. It's Tom constantly slacking Priya about minor details. Use the blue icon, not the green one.
That's the expertise trap and control anxiety just gone wild.
So what does Tom need to do?
He needs to recognize the profound psychological cost of his constant interruptions. Every microcheck breaks Priya's concentration. It destroys her flow state. It erodes trust.
And it forces her to spend mental energy justifying basic choices.
Great. So Tom has to consciously transition from being a player to a coach.
So how does he do that? How does he set the guardrails but still grant autonomy?
He has to delegate outcomes, not tasks. For instance, Priya, the outcome we need is a 20% reduction in app load time by Friday. How you achieve that is entirely up to your expertise.
So he sets the metric, but gives her total ownership of the process.
Yes. And instead of surveillance, he uses coaching as his intervention.
So instead of checking in,
He uses structured coaching questions that force Priya to think strategically ahead of time. What potential risks do you foresee with your chosen approach? And how have you built mitigation plans for them?
so this builds her strategic muscle.
And it satisfies Tom's need for control through documented preparation. And it reinforces trust, which is the exact opposite of what micromanagement does.
These individual frameworks are so valuable, but it brings up a crucial point. If the problem is systemic driven by cognitive load and training gaps, then the solutions have to be systemic too.
We need intervention at 3 levels.
So let's start with the organization itself. How do we rewire the whole operating system?
Organizations have to mandate power awareness training. This can't be some voluntary module you click through. It has to be treated like an occupational hazard for anyone promoted into management. Leaders have to be trained specifically on Keltner's power paradox, how their brain chemistry literally changes, and on their own cognitive biases under pressure.
And you have to measure these skills if you want them to stick.
That is non-negotiable. You have to implement robust 360-degree feedback that focuses specifically on empathy, trust, and communication effectiveness, not just on task completion.
And critically,
Critically, these metrics have to be tied directly to compensation and promotion. What gets measured gets managed, but what gets compensated gets prioritized.
and since we know cognitive load is the enemy of empathy, the organization have to address that burden.
They need to create cognitive relief valves. That could mean realistic workloads. It could mean administrative support for scheduling and email, or just protected thinking time.
A less overwhelmed brain is a more empathetic brain.
It is. It reduces the likelihood of leaders defaulting to that blunt, resource-saving communication style.
Okay, so for the leaders themselves, what's the daily discipline they need? The sources suggest a fantastic framework for giving feedback that takes the personal sting out of it.
That's the SBI framework, Situation Behavior Impact. This is the absolute antidote to blunt, accusatory criticism. It forces the leader to be objective, specific, and to focus only on the consequences of the action, not the character of the person.
Give us that specific example from the source material, because I want to hear the contrast.
Okay, so instead of the typical, Alex, your report is flawed and late,
which is what most people get.
Right. You apply the SBI structure. You start with objective context. Alex, in the Q3 report you submitted yesterday, situation, the methodology in Section 3 relied on Survey A without including the mandatory data from Database B, behavior.
Okay.
The impact is that our finance team may legitimately question the validity of your projection, which will delay final approval by a week impact.
The difference is night and day. It's anchored in observable reality and measurable consequences.
Exactly. Leaders also have to consciously work to reduce that social distance that power creates. They should practice a radical listening. Institute a 2-minute rule in every one-on-one.
Where the leader just listens.
Only listens and takes notes for 2 full minutes before they speak. It ensures the team member feels truly heard.
And that includes making time for non-transactional conversations, I imagine.
Yes, through power distance reduction. Consciously schedule informal, agenda-free check-ins. Move beyond the task list. The only agenda is understanding the landscape. What are the biggest blockers preventing your progress, and how can I help remove them?
Finally, let's turn to the employee, because while the burden of fixing the system isn't theirs, they can use some proactive strategies, a kind of psychological judo, really, to manage upward communication.
Absolutely. To counteract that condescension from the power paradox, an employee can use the perception check frame.
How does that sound?
It sounds like I may have misread the tone, but when you called my idea cute, I perceived that as a dismissal of its strategic value. Was that your intent, or were you aiming for something else?
That's powerful. It forces the leader to engage in metacognition, to think about the impact of their own words.
It shifts them out of that automatic tendency. It's brilliant.
It makes them accountable without you sounding defensive. And for the classic micromanager.
The best defense is proactive transparency. Instead of waiting for the 5th Slack message that breaks your focus, the employee offers a structured, reliable solution to the boss's anxiety, you can suggest. To make sure you feel confident without needing to check in, I'll send you a structured daily email at the end of the day. 3 bullets, what I completed, any blockers, and my top priority for tomorrow. Would that give you the visibility you need?
It satisfies the leader's need for control, but on the employee's terms. It protects their focus.
It's perfect. If we connect this all back to the beginning, the bad boss communicator isn't some fixed, terrible archetype. They are the predictable product of a system that grants power without the psychological toolkit, that promotes expertise without teaching coaching.
And that just overwhelms the cognitive capacity needed for empathy.
Yes. And by focusing on these theories, the power paradox, cognitive load, the curse of knowledge, we move definitively from just being frustrated and blaming people to having a functional, scalable diagnosis.
And that diagnosis is immensely powerful. It lets us build solutions instead of just, tolerating bad communication or waiting for a new manager. The ultimate goal here is to infuse hierarchy with humanity.
And transform our workplaces into functional ecosystems of psychological safety.
One conscious conversation and one disciplined framework at a time.
This transformation definitely requires investment, but the payoff in talent retention and productivity is just massive.
So we'll leave you with this provocative thought for your own career. This entire deep dive hinges on the idea that communication, self-awareness, emotional regulation. These are power skills that can be systematically taught. So if your organization invests heavily in technical training, software updates, new methodologies, compliance, what is the measurable hidden cost in turnover, in lost innovation, in reduced productivity of not investing in mandatory leadership training that is focused specifically on emotional regulation and power awareness?
That's something to consider.
It is. It's something for you to consider and maybe even advocate for as you build bridges in your own career.